All right. So as I stated, we are going to focus on executive functioning today. This is a PowerPoint that you guys can always ask me for in the future if you want to present it directly to your systems, and I'm happy to assist with that. It becomes a really important topic when working with our systems because it's often overlooked. So to start, what is executive control? So executive control is this umbrella term. It captures all of the cognitive processes that direct behavior regulation. So obviously, that's very important to the work that we're doing. Almost often, we are involved in our systems because they're having difficulty with behavior regulation. Oftentimes, the systems also are very focused on future goals and planning, which is a really great process for our individuals, but there are aspects of executive control that inhibit that. And there might be frustration. I'm sure you guys have all worked with systems that have expressed frustration when, something doesn't go as planned or they're not able to execute something properly. And a lot of that is not just about their autism or their psychiatric diagnoses or their ID. It's about their executive functioning under this executive control. So I'm going to talk about all of these things in more detail, but the categories and the processes that are under executive control are working memory, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, monitoring, and planning. So these are executive domains. So working memory, just for quick understanding, this is the ability to hold input in your mind for quick use. So not only do we see deficits in working memory when we're working with someone with, mild, moderate, severe ID, but again, when we work with people with trauma and heavy anxiety, they also have deficits in these areas in relation to their to their executive functioning. So their ability to take in information and then use it quickly later is diminished. Inhibition, so we see this often in our population. So the ability, to stop and think before acting. Oftentimes we might hear systems say like they know better, but they might not have been able to stop themselves to think of what they know, to do something differently. Mental flexibility, so the ability to shift gears when a new response is needed. This becomes very difficult for our individuals to process, to be able to get off course. They are very routine oriented, as we know. Generativity, so the ability to generate novel ideas and behavior spontaneously. So oftentimes, if something that they didn't plan for occurs, they struggle to spontaneously respond. This could be in communication, socially. This could also be in response to a stressor or a dangerous situation. And we're actually going to do an activity in regards to generativity during the presentation. Self-monitoring, so being able to look for errors so you can change your response and learn from mistakes. Another area that I'm sure we can all think of a lot of our cases that struggle with this, right? So the ability to learn from a mistake. So they may be able to process with staff or ourselves or their therapist and know that they did something wrong or they could have done something different, but that aspect of learning from their mistakes might be really difficult. And then planning, so being able to create steps that you will follow to get to your goal. That organization that requires can be very challenging. So, Dr. Kent and I love our pictures of our brains. We bring it into every CET and training possible. So the area that is circled in purple is the prefrontal cortex. This is where the executive domains live. So as you can see, there's a greenish color for attention of the section of the brain that focuses on attention. Right below that, where it's blue, is the area of the prefrontal cortex that focuses on behavior and judgment. And kind of surrounding those two areas in an orangey brown is emotional responses. So when there's deficits in the prefrontal cortex, that's where the executive domains live. That's where we see these deficits to their executive functioning skills that we then see in their behavior and their symptomology. So the frontal cortex, to talk about some of its functions. So consciousness, how we know what we are doing within our environment. So the fact that I know I'm sitting here at the Resource Center in this chair presenting to you all, I'm conscious of that. How we initiate activity in response to our environment. So just earlier, both Jillian and I have a 10 o'clock meeting, so we both can't sit here talking on Zoom, right? So we have to initiate our activity in response to those changes in our environment. Judgment we make about what occurs in our daily activities. So again, that goes into planning, organization, making quick changes or decisions in regards to what might be going on. Controlling our emotional response, so our inhibition, controlling our expressive language, and assigns meaning to the word we choose. There are a lot of concerns that occur in the frontal lobe. It's not just executive functioning. So just to give some background, sequencing also belongs in the frontal lobes. So this is the inability to plan or sequence of complex movements needed to complete multi-step tasks, such as making coffee. We'll hear a lot of times some complaints from parents saying like, well, they just cleaned their room, but that could be a really loaded task. There's a lot of steps involved. So they may need that assistance in really planning out those steps and being very organized in it. There can be a loss of spontaneity in interaction with others, the loss of flexibility in thinking. A lot of this is what we see in some of the social deficits in regards to the people we work with. Perseveration also lives in the frontal lobe. We see that quite a bit with our individuals with autism, that persistence of a single thought, kind of everything surrounds that one topic. There are definitely ways that you can work through perseveration. Obviously, we all know that, but it does live in the frontal lobe. Attention, so the inability to focus on tasks. So those ADHD symptoms that we see in our cases at times also is a brain condition of the frontal lobe. Emotionally labile, so there are mood changes in social behavior or personality, difficulty with problem solving, so that is related to executive functioning, and inability to express language, so there's Broca's aphasia. So the frontal lobe is really kind of the house of everything that we tend to work with this population, right? Everything really kind of lives in that frontal lobe. And then again, the executive functionings that we're talking about kind of live right here in the prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobe. Okay, so to get back to our executive domain. So working memory, as I stated before, it's the capacity to hold material in your mind and manipulate as necessary for brief periods. So it's not long-term memory in the regard of, remembering things that happened when you were a child. This is things that, we're learning this information now, and then you're going to be able to apply it to your systems, to your crisis plans, to the work that you do. That's the use of working memory. So it operates very quickly. It's a very quick process within your brain. It's a temporary storage. The working memory function in the brain kind of manipulates information so that you can use it as you see fit. And it takes attention to be able to concentrate. So if any of you are not paying attention right now, you're not going to have an active working memory in regard to the information because you're not focused on it, right? And I'm not saying anyone's not paying attention, just an example. The manipulate information is really important because it's not just about repeating the exact same information in the exact same way, like memorizing this PowerPoint, right? It's about taking the important factors and using it as you see fit. So a really good example of that, I don't really know if we kind of went over this in the beginning of START, so maybe Jess has heard me say this before, but something that had come up early on in START when we were doing crisis plans in our first few years is, you guys all know I provide a lot of edits and comments, so do your team leaders. And our goal is that you're taking those edits and comments, understanding them, manipulating them in your head, and then applying them to future plans, right? So we had but a situation where they, our early coordinators would make the edits in that plan, but then it was like Groundhog's Day a little bit where we just kept having to give the same edits because they weren't manipulating it, holding on to it, and moving it forward. Of course, being a clinician, I was like, I talked about working memory, and we talked about, the ability to manipulate that, and how stress and anxiety of this process and being a brand new program might have been inhibiting that process. So those are just some examples in, our daily life that can happen. If you think about our individuals, this is a very complicated process. The majority of our individuals don't have focused attention. So that right off the bat is going to impact their working memory, right? They may not be able to manipulate the information. So they may take it in, they may seem as though they understand it, but then when the situation presents itself, they're not able to manipulate that information and utilize it towards that new environment. So, it may come up in a, group home or in a family home where, they tell the individual, they talk to the individual about maybe their behavior and what they could do differently. And we talk about coping skills. And then the next day, something stressful comes up and they get aggressive again, instead of using the coping skill that they had talked about the previous day. Again, their ability to manipulate that information and apply it is challenged. Okay, so next up is cognitive flexibility. So this is simply the brain's ability to transition from thinking about one concept to another. It's incredibly important in self-regulation. It's also incredibly challenging for a lot of the individuals that we work with. They're pretty inflexible, especially if you think about someone who has a lot of perseveration. We have quite a few here at the Resource Center that have come in the last couple of weeks. Rajat, Rohit, we have Manoj coming in. They perseverate quite a bit. So if they're, focused on, let's say, Miley Cyrus, and we want them to then start focusing on, positive interventions or learning about coping skills, they really can't make that jump very easily. So something that we try to do here is incorporate those perseverations and those interests. So like what we did an activity, I think it was Monday, with our individual who loves Miley Cyrus, where he was having trouble engaging in the activity that was about strengths. So we had him use Miley Cyrus's name and the first letter of, all of her letters, and identify all of his strengths based on her name. He loved it. And he actually did it. I mean, we had to laminate it for him. He was so proud of it. I don't know if you heard about that, Jess. It was a really awesome day. But he was able to actually do the activity, and we were able to have him have some ability to have flexible thinking, to think about strengths, because his perseveration topic was included. So there are ways to support that. But again, if we're expecting our individuals to transition easily from one concept to another, even in school, from math to science, from English to math, those transitions can be very difficult. Oftentimes people talk about difficulty with transition in regards to like major aspects of the day, like going to school, coming home from school. But majority of the time, there's difficulty in transitions hundreds of times a day, just from different topics within one class, from class to class, in day program, from activity to activity, even here, from activity to activity. So cognitive flexibility becomes really challenging with someone that has executive functioning deficits. It's incredibly important in the self-regulation. If you can't transition from topic to topic, it's really, really hard to provide yourself with some self-regulation. Does anyone have any questions so far? I got a head shake from Eric. I got a head shake from Liz. All right, thank you guys. All right, so self-monitoring. So as we just talked about, the difficulties of self-regulation, self-monitoring is also really difficult in that self-regulation process. Self-monitoring can interfere with the ability to attain goals, to anticipate the future, can impact their ability to learn. We may hear, and I'm going to say we do hear from a lot of our systems that, he knows better, but does he? Has he truly learned better? Is he able to self-monitor and then apply that information to do better and to learn better? repeating a behavior that does not help us to achieve our own stated goals before can be related to this problem. So they continue to do the negative behavior, they continue to do something that's not helpful, that gets in the way of achieving our goals. Planning. So this is critical in goal-oriented behavior. You know, we all have plans. In order to even get to this position and get to this stage in our career, we all had plans. No one just ended up with a master's degree, right? No one just decided one day and said, I'm going to be a licensed mental health counselor. And then bam, there I am, right? It all took a lot of planning, and that planning took many, many years. It's the same for our individuals and their goals. Whatever their goal might be, it's planning is a part of it. Being able to formulate actions in advance. So it's not a spur in the moment decision. It's things that take time. There's a patience aspect there, right? And there's that planning aspect of each action impacts the previous and the one after it. Being able to approach tasks in an organized and strategic and efficient manner. Very important. Again, nobody ends up in their career without that planning, without organized thought, without some strategic work. And think about how difficult that would be for some of your individuals. Like, put yourself in their shoes. If they have a goal of obtaining a full-time job, and right now, you know, they're not able to be in their community independently, and they, you know, don't really have any employment skills. That's going to take a lot of organized and strategic planning and actions in order to reach that goal over the next several years. The ability to look ahead is also really challenging and a really large part of planning ahead, because you need to be able to say, like, okay, in 5 years, I want to have a full-time job. But sometimes they really don't have, one, control over their day-to-day activities, and two, they don't really even know how to get to that point. So it becomes very overwhelming and very stressful. Identifying different options. So as we all know, I'm sure we've all experienced it, that our goals and our strategic, organized action plans may not always happen as we had hoped, and we have to pivot. And that pivot may be really difficult. And then monitoring those outcomes, modifying those plans when you might have to pivot. Again, all parts of planning. You know, I'm talking about obviously these larger life goals, but we can even apply all of this to a goal of cooking a meal. It still takes effort to look ahead, to be organized. You know, if you need to make, you know, chicken Parmesan, there's a certain step that you have to do to make chicken Parmesan, right? And if you're not organized and you don't have all of the right ingredients, that's going to be really challenging. So again, you know, the example I use of these larger goals, it still applies to things that are smaller in the individuals that we work with day-to-day life. So generativity, so the ability to generate new ideas. So this facilitates social response and problem solving. So I am going to set a timer for 1 minute. And I want everyone to get a piece of paper. If you don't have one handy, I'll give you a second. Okay, does everyone in Oakdale have one? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, Sarah, you're good? Okay, Eric, you're good? Liz? Jess? Levy? Okay, so I'm gonna set a timer for 1 minute. Oh, that was 1 hour. And during this 1 minute, you are going to write down as many animals as you can think of. Oakdale, I know you're in the same room. I don't want you to share. I want you to do this on your own, okay? So I'm going to start the timer now. It's backwards. It doesn't help you. Pencils down. All right, so I'd love for all of you to, I'm going to kind of call on you one at a time to unmute and tell me how many you came up with. So I'll give you a second just to count them. Hey, Mona. Didn't see you joined us, so I'm glad you're here. All right, so I'm going to start with our group in Oakdale. So Brittany O, how many did you have?
I only got 18.
18. Brittany M.
I got 26, but I didn't know when he started the timer. Show off.
Jess.
I got 21.
Okay. I'm going to move to Sarah.
20.
Okay. Eric.
I got 11.
Okay. Jessica Levy.
16.
Okay. Mona, did you join us in time to do the activity?
I think I missed a few seconds, so give me that. I got 13.
Okay. And then Liz. You're muted.
There, I got 25.
Okay. So Brittany M and Liz are at our top with 25 and 26. So the average adult is about 20 in 1 minute. So you guys weren't too far off. I was closer when I did this in like the 15 range. So don't feel bad, anyone that was low. I like panicked. I was like, I can't think of anything. So what were did anyone have a strategy?
You know, I got young kids, so I just thought about like nursery rhymes.
That's
Like
a good
lions fighting
strategy.
bears, you
Yeah.
know, like I thought about the Lion King, the different movies that I forced to watch with the kids.
Yeah, that's a
And,
great
you know,
strategy.
A lot of animals, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Great strategy.
Yeah.
Did anyone else have a strategy that they tried?
I
So
did like ocean
Oop, go, Jeff.
animals or like farm animals. Like
Okay.
where they
So you
live.
did like categories?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sarah?
I kind of did the same thing. I did kind of where when you're thinking of a certain sort of like maybe like house animal, and then like when I thought of cat, I thought of mouse because you know cats chasing mice, and then I thought of the zoo and what animals you would see there, or like a petting zoo or something like that. Then I thought of like if I went to like Bali and what I would see there.
Yep. Categories. Categories definitely seem to help, whether it be like how Liz used categories with like nursery rhymes and movies and things like that, or how Jess and Sarah described it as like categories of the type of animals. Again, the average adult is about 20 in 1 minute, so it's not as many as you probably would have assumed. It is a verbal fluency test. So this is actually something that is part of psychologicals. So literally naming something of a category, animals, whatever it might be. But imagine how difficult that could be kind of under pressure when you're getting an evaluation, right? And even for our guys with have very limited interest. So if you ever see any verbal fluency tests and when you review a psychological or a neuropsych, this is probably something that they did. And it just gives you an idea of how our brains work. If you were lower, it doesn't mean that anything's wrong. It's just an activity. Okay. So to move forward a little bit. So how do these executive functioning deficits contribute to emotional challenges, which are common in the population we work with, right? So as we went through it, all the different aspects of executive functioning, my hope is that you were thinking of different cases or thinking about, how they may relate. So all of them can relate to someone with autism or ID or both. The inflexibility that we've talked about today is key in developing anxiety. So when we have someone that has anxiety, they may have some underlying executive functioning deficits. you can have executive functioning deficits and challenges with executive functioning without autism and without intellectual disabilities as well. So I want to just make that clear. It's not only people that have, IDD that have executive functioning deficits. They can come into play with trauma. They can come into play when you're very overwhelmed and with anxiety. So that difficulty with change, the problem shifting responses can all be related to that underlying vulnerability of the executive functioning. So some ways to support someone with executive functioning challenges. And these are things that you can pull and put into crisis plans. You can use them, like I said, in trainings with systems. Jess is here as part of her internship, but Mona and Jess as coaches, these are things that you probably utilize in coaching all the time. So limiting the flow and overall load of incoming information. This should make sense given what we talked about today, right? So we want to make sure that things are communicated slowly, that we're not overwhelming their senses in trying to give too much information. Processing speed is something that we talk about a lot in our population, and that's not related to executive functioning deficits. But if we think about working memory, if we think about inflexibility and all of the other things that we talked about, when you give them too much information, they're not going to be able to take it all in. Right. So we want to make sure that the load of information is slower so that they have that time. Again, providing more time for processing. This impacts their ability to actually use the information later with their working memory to be able to help plan for the future. Their inflexibility could also be impacted by that increased processing time. Using quiet spaces or a space that's not overstimulating when you're speaking to them is really important. The guys we work with have a lot of sensory sensitivities in relation to their autism. So when they're in a loud place and you're trying to instruct them of something, they're not able to fully dedicate that time. Like we talked about with working memory, the ability to have focused attention is incredibly important. So if they already have these challenges, the ability to move forward and to work through them are going to be impacted if you don't have that quiet space. Not throwing in extra information into the middle of a set of instructions. So this is sometimes really hard to do. So if you're kind of telling them how to do something or you're working with them and then you're like, oh, wait, I just thought something else. Then you go on these tangents and I guarantee that a lot of us are guilty of it in our day-to-day life, right? But with our individuals, we want to make sure that we're not throwing in that extra information, that we're talking to our systems about being very structured, only having one person talk to them at a time. Making sure that it's, step 1 through 5, and you're not throwing in different things or different expectations. Using multiple modalities, something that we talk up to our systems about a lot, and it's very impactful with someone executive functioning, having a visual schedule, having visual prompts. So even individuals who are fully verbal can benefit from these visual prompts and these visual schedules. So that's why everything at the Resource Center has both. We verbally talk through our schedule and we use the visual representation. It's really important to strengthen that information for the individual. Repetition. I think repetition is something that the systems get the most frustrated with. Well, they know this, they should know this. We tell them all the time. So, I'm done telling them. I've heard it in the systems I work with. And I'm like, well, you can't be done telling them because they need that repetition. So making sure that they're reflecting back, even with our receptive and expressive communication. I just talked to this with Eric, David, and Lori just yesterday when we were talking about crisis plans with the need to be concrete, to have repetition, to reflect things back. With receptive communication, oftentimes the systems overestimate their receptive communication, right? So that has the ability to have them not learn and we don't really know that they actually don't know what they might need to know in order to plan or to move things forward or use a coping skill. So making sure that not only are you reflecting things back to them, but you're having them reflect things back to us. Providing rules and expectation reminders. So we're not talking about rules in regards to these bigger things, but the expectations of a specific environment, the rule of, with social expectations. I know we've talked about certain cases where prior to going into the community, maybe they have a social story about some social expectations if they have some boundary issues. Again, those reminders, not just saying, oh, well, they know that they're not supposed to touch a stranger in the dollar store. Well, they may need those reminders. And then again, making sure that the systems are setting expectations that are appropriate for that individual. They're not too high, they're not too low. I think we see it with group homes where they have like blanket expectations, and then they may have individuals at all different functioning levels and some that don't have executive functioning deficits as strongly as others. And those expectations, if they're too high or too low, they're not going to be supportive to that individual. Some of the individuals, especially the higher functioning individuals, they still will have executive functioning challenges, and they may be really embarrassed to ask for help. They may not want to ask for things to be repeated. They may have high expectations of themselves and feel a lot of shame in needing extra support. So we want to make sure that the systems understand that and that that's built into their day. Recommending that people do tasks together with the individual. So even things like cooking a meal or cleaning their bedroom, planning it out, making a step-by-step plan, and then doing it together. Have them feel that support. Okay, we're going to break this down. First, we're going to make the bed. How do we make the bed, right? Even the bed making needs to be broken down into smaller tasks. Encouragement and support. A big part of obviously the START model in general with positivity and strength spotting, but we want to do that throughout. We want to make sure that they feel as though they are doing well, that even if they need help, it's okay, that's what we're here for. Having the system provide check-ins, making sure that the person feels supported, that they have what they need, that they don't have any questions. And recognizing that it's not just about when someone is escalated or showing signs of crisis, that their working memory is overwhelmed. Their working memory can be overwhelmed at baseline. They can just have a deficit in working memory, and that can just be a difficulty. They don't have to be anxious or upset or agitated for these factors to be overwhelmed. And then just a couple of reminders. So speaking does not equal thinking and understanding. So that goes again to what I said about expressive and receptive language. So they may be able to talk the talk and their expressive language might be really strong, but that doesn't mean that they understand everything. Taking in what's said in the moment does not mean that they've learned a skill. So they may be able to show you that they can make that bed or cook that meal. Doesn't mean that they can do that independently moving forward. And then again, back to that repetition needs. So I'm going to stop my share so I can see everyone's faces. So thoughts, questions, any cases that people are thinking about that they want to bring up? Mm-hmm. Mona, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, always. No, I was just thinking, not that I really want to bring it up, but I just finished having a early morning session with Victoria Marson. We all know that she was at the Resource Center with Rohit. So it was funny that she asked me with her deficits, she said, is he okay? I said, was he friendly? Yeah, he's a pretty nice fellow, but it seems a little odd. And it was just funny that she was analyzing him. She said, I had my hearing aids in, but he was speaking like really fast and it was kind of hard to keep up. And he just kept repeating himself over and over again. So, it's a little odd. Is he okay? I said, well, he tends to repeat, but he's pretty okay. So that was just funny that even with her deficits, she clearly recognized what Rohit's were. I was curious.
Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts of systems that might need some additional training in this area? How you might go about that?
Well, I would say Joseph Barbella's system, but I think between myself, Steve, and Amanda, we're sort of on it. But yes, Mother will give him instructions while I'm there or tell him a word. He's a word guy, but she's talking at this pace, and she may say gorilla, she may say giraffe, and this is the pace that she's using, and he's trying to hurry up and write down, and I'm trying to slow her down while calming him down to repeat the spelling, and she just cannot help herself. And then of course he gets agitated, And that's when she gets hit or
Mhm.
he strips his clothes or whatever. So I'm having to manage both of them really while I'm
Mhm.
there.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes when with certain systems, and this may be the case for Mrs. Barbell and it may not be, but having them help them to understand why they should slow it down and why one thing at a time, and relate it back to their conditions and their literally their brain impairment. Sometimes that helps them to kind of take a step back and accept the feedback. Because I know sometimes with that system, they don't love the feedback. But if they understood, like, it's literally a brain impairment, it's a brain condition, maybe we'd make some progress if they knew. I'm not sure about that system, but we can try it.
One of the systems I'm thinking of is JJ Lambert system.
Mhm.
How the mom has her own executive functioning deficits and just trying, I guess, to, kind of develop this presentation into something that like she could understand more
Yeah.
and how it affects both of them.
Yeah.
So that's just something that's kind of like I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can definitely talk about that further, because this is definitely good for, clinical staff, even direct support staff. I've done it with direct support staff, but if you have a parent who also has her own executive functioning deficits, we would definitely need to kind of just be very, very much more basic and one thing at a time, and maybe even one, domain at a time, rather than coming in with all of the executive domains. Maybe even, every time you meet with her, you kind of review one of the domains. It might even need to be that, step by step. Do you guys see how incorporating these into not only your daily work with trainings and things like that, but also in regards to like our crisis plans and using these interventions? And again, that last page, you guys can take and apply right to your crisis plans. But in how we explain executive functioning within our vulnerabilities and pull it into the interventions. Do you guys see how important that could be for our systems? That was the purpose. Does anyone have any questions?
What about emotional control for Peter Marrero?
Yeah, I don't know the case extremely well. Can you give a little background?
So like yesterday I went to his school to observe him, and
Mhm.
he has a lot of self-injurious behaviors.
Mhm.
So when he gets like really frustrated with himself, he like really like tends to like smack himself in the head. Yesterday he came in, he was sitting by himself, smacking himself in the head, ripping at his skin to the point that he was bleeding all over his hands, screaming out to the classroom saying that Peter's a bad boy, Peter's a bad boy, to the point where like we were trying to talk to him and couldn't do
Yeah.
anything. It was like his emotions, the control was like out the window,
Mhm.
and it was really hard to bring him back in. I mean, he ended up liking my fingernails, and that kind of actually distracted him, and he started feeling my nails, and I did this to him, and then he
Yeah.
stopped. He had another student come up to him and say, I get frustrated sometimes,
Mhm.
which calmed
Very
him down
sweet.
even more to make him stop doing what he was
Yeah.
doing. But it took about 2 hours
Wow.
of him sitting by himself and not being able to control his
Mm-hmm.
emotions.
So it sounds like there could be a level of his own expectations for himself if what he was getting
Yes.
frustrated about. And depending on what was frustrating him, it may have
couldn't do
maybe
his work.
related. Yeah. So it may be related to kind of maybe the work is too hard. So we need to look at that. But also, did he really understand like the steps needed to get the work done? So there could be some planning aspects in regard to that with organization. So there may be some ability for like the teacher not to limit the expectation, but maybe just break it down a little bit further for him.
Mhm.
And again, maybe, my cousin is a special ed teacher, and her and I have talked about this. And she's like, well, I have some students who I'll just give like their work for the day because they want to work independently. And I was like, and what ends up happening? And she's like, well, usually they end up being aggressive. And I was like, well, you overwhelm them. You gave them like an entire day's worth of work. They're like, well, it's so they can do it at their leisure, so they don't get it that way. So, and again, that's a very just basic situation. So not knowing obviously everything of what led to that, but I would look at kind of the planning, the organization, the expectations, not only of the system of him, but also of himself.
Yeah.
Some self-esteem kind of things. Maybe he
He had
puts a lot of pressure.
Negative self-talk for sure.
Yeah. And then
Calling himself stupid.
Yeah. Yeah. So there might be some work there that can be done. And it sounds like sensory with you kind of doing this to his hand and even him feeling your nails, like that's all sensory related. So
Yes.
maybe even doing a sensory assessment or having OT do, because ours is very basic. The OT in the school can do a very intensive one, and maybe getting him some, appropriate sensory tools that he can utilize, even if it's on like as a sensory diet. So it's not when it gets too far.
I brought tools into his house before I went to school with him, and he likes, like, I gave him glitter putty.
Yeah.
Putty that's like wet,
Yeah.
but not wet, and or like a stress ball that was like wet but not wet. It's just stuff you can get at the Dollar Tree.
Yeah.
Absolutely loved it. Any frustration that he had in that moment, and I gave him the glitter putty, done. Distracted completely.
So does he have those tools at school?
I'm actually going to bring them next week when I go back again, because I did give it to him and his mom, but they didn't bring it into school. So I'm just going to do it myself, and I'm going to try it out with him in school now. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. So there's a combination of,
I have this if you want it, Jess.
Yes, he was playing with a feather yesterday at his desk, so that would probably be something very good.
Okay,
I also even thought of like a weighted blanket that had fur on it to like put on his
he
lap
sounds
or
very
on his
tactile.
shoulders.
Yeah. So I think there's two ways of kind of the reactive response with sensory tools and things like that to help calm down the nervous system. But then there's also looking at the executive functioning domains and what might be leading to that frustration and that outburst with planning and working memory and those expectations. Absolutely. That's a great case to talk about. Sounds like you're doing great work. And I never thought of like a duster as a sensory tool. So that's awesome, Mona. I think I'm going to have Jillian get them for the house because it's so true, because they're so light and like the feel of them. But I never thought of a duster. So awesome.
When you're a coach, you think of any and every
I
little thing that
appreciate
people
it.
wouldn't expect.
Yeah. Well, Jillian and I purchased like hundreds and hundreds of dollars of sensory stuff for the house yesterday. So the sensory room will actually be a sensory room one day soon. Right now it's just a chill space. But it will actually be a sensory room soon. So I incorporate some dusters. But yes, I appreciate the creativity. Does anyone else have any cases to bring up or any thoughts in regards to the topic? Okay. Does anyone have any educational topic for this meeting? Actually, no, next month is set. So next month I sent you guys an email. We're going to do it in person as long as we're still permitted to based on COVID protocols. Shirley just got back today. So hopefully by the end of this week, early next week, I'll find out the location. But we're going to focus on systems work next month. So our newer coordinators, so Eric, David, Lori, and Amani, who started this week in orientation. You guys will meet her next week. She'll be in the office in Suffolk as of Friday. But all of you guys will have kind of my PowerPoint training by the next clinical supervision that's all together. But anyone that's been with us for a bit, so Jess would know of this, and Sarah, and maybe Liz actually too. But we used to do a bit of role play with the systems training. And it's not something we really could figure out how to do, or I could figure out how to do over Zoom effectively. So we're going to be doing this role play activity in person, again, COVID permitting, during our next all coordinator clinical supervision. So the goal will be, we'll have some admin participating. They will have roles of their role within the systems meeting, and then the coordinators will all cycle in to run the systems meeting from start to finish. So we'll be doing that in person. I'm going to bring in some snacks and some goodies for us. It'll be our first clinical supervision back in person, which is exciting. But so hopefully nothing changes in the next month and we can all be together in person for that. But in after November, if anyone has any topics or clinical topics that you think would benefit us in doing trainings on, I've kind of run through our mental health grouping. I want to do executive functioning. It's come up quite a bit in some of the consults I've done. But so if anyone has any topics that they would like to see, feel free to send me an email. I'll be starting to plan for December shortly. So reach out to me if you have anything you would like to see in these meetings. Otherwise, we are able to end early and you guys can get some work done. I'm sure you all have things to catch up on. So I will give you your time back. But thank you all for joining and I'll see you all soon.